So you changed your name. So it's Tyger now.
That's right.
From what? What did you change it from?
So my birth name is Tyler.
Tyler.
Kind of a classic American name.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, well, when I was young, I was a very active individual, and I was a very competitive person. And through my toddlers, through my elementary school years, even through my middle school years, and whenever me and my older siblings would play sports or do anything like that, I was always like very fierce and aggressive in my interactions with them. And so my dad gave me a nickname, and he called me Tiger growing up. And so, even more recently, with some personal reflections just on my career path, my own interests, how I live day to day. Like, in one respect, if I look at the last decade, I have changed dramatically. And in terms of the behaviors that I exhibit and the way in which I conduct myself, like night and day compared to who I was when I was, let's say, in my teenage years, right? But at the same time, there are these like core principles or core behaviors about me, of how I orient myself in the world, of like, I am a very ambitious person. I am still a very competitive individual. And a lot of those, kind of identifiers of why my dad nicknamed me Tiger when I was young still exist today. And so with this whole move to Korea and a new chapter in my life, I decided I would do the name change as well. And this is something that I had been thinking about for many months, even before I had moved. And it kind of felt like the right thing to do.
Sure. But is it like a social media name change, or is it, because in the UK you have to do something called Depol, where you fill out a form and you pay some money and whatever.
I hate,
like, is this like is this a social media stunt, or is this like an actual?
Well, I mean, I guess you can interpret it how you want.
Like your Korean visa, what's on your Korean visa? What's written on there? Your name?
I don't have a Korean. I just have a tour. I'm on a tourist visa right now. But like, I haven't legally changed my name.
Sure.
Right, and I don't really want to go through the bureaucratic pains of filing government documents and doing all of that stuff.
New passport, etc., etc.
Yeah. But I mean, it is real in the sense that, like, when I introduce myself to people,
it's what I call you.
Yeah,
right.
And it is what everybody else has been calling me as well. And it's, I did change everything on social media. So, look, like, to some extent, sure, there is a dimension where it's like you attract attention by the actions that you take.
Sure.
Right, and if you are, I think changing your name is an interesting thing in general, because even throughout history there have been figures who, when they have gone through, let's say, deep personal evolution, that they try and demarcate, their prior self compared to their latter self. Right, and even like in the Bible, it's like Saul goes to Paul, right? It's like a deep transformation, right? And I find it interesting that, and not to get into too deep of political waters, but like the whole gender pronoun stuff.
Right.
Like, to me, that there's some dangers there, like some deep dangers, because that's tied to like fundamental dimensions of one's like genetics as well. It's like you are either a male or a female. But when it comes to somebody's name, which is interesting, it's like you just inherit the name that your parents gave you for the most part. But you can also change it if you want. Right? And that affects how people perceive you, and that affects how other people perceive you as well. I am generally fascinated by even the study of how people's names maybe affect their life trajectories. And there is no like formal study, but let's say, like, for example, that you had a kid and for one reason or another you named him like failure. Right? And that's well known in the society of what exactly failure means. And people go through the world and they call him that day in and day out, right? And there's some sort of a brainwashing that I think happens even subconsciously, of like, at some point, everybody's calling you a failure, you are going to believe that you're a failure, right? And on the flip side, it's like, if you are given a name that inherits attributes of strength, and you are constantly told that that is the person that you are, that has to have some sort of an impact on how you live your life and how you perceive yourself, right? And so I think that it's interesting that we haven't seen this become more of a commonality, but I think it's a pretty powerful thing. I mean, even in the business world, when it comes to branding, people know this, right? Is especially in markets that are highly competitive, where it's hard to differentiate your product, simply by picking a name that communicates some level of quality or value or reliability, that has profound impacts on the consumer behavior.
Yeah.
Right. So for kind of all different dimensions of these reasons, I thought this is the right decision to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of something I'm new to this year since moving to Korea, but I have lots of Buddhist friends who have Dharma names.
What does that mean? Dharma names?
Dharma means practice in
Dharma.
Sanskrit.
Yes, sure.
And it was very confusing for me because people would be calling them or I'd see one name on like a messaging app, and people would be calling them.
Yeah.
But it was kind of strange because they're often, at least with the Korean Buddhists I know, the Dharma names are usually only very slightly different to the Korean names. And as someone who's still learning Hangul and pronunciation and stuff, it was very difficult for me to like actually cotton onto this fact.
Yeah.
But it's a very common thing. You're saying it's a very common spiritual thing. They call it nominative determinism, when something kind of follows the name that it's given. And I think, there's definitely some truth in that, mostly because of how kind of silly and messy humanity is. You think that we just judge something based on what it does or something, but it's not true. And as much as we'd like that to be true, I don't think it ever will be true, But yeah, I think it's an interesting... The only thing that would worry me about changing my name, because I'm not particularly keen on my name. Okay, fine, like it's biblical, right? But as far as I'm aware, my parents kind of picked the first name they saw in the baby book that looked okay, because they didn't get it from the Bible or whatever.
Yeah.
And I also don't have a middle name.
My
sister was the first. She got a middle name because she was the first. And then my parents kind of gave up after that fact. True story, by the way. True story. That's actually what happened. And one thing for me is I'd be worried about changing my name just because I don't want to kind of disrespect my parents' decision.
Yes.
I don't know how you feel about that, but you're right. Tyler is a very, very American, kind of middle American, maybe Christian name. I don't know.
Well, the other dynamic here is that Tyger was a nickname that my dad had given me, right?
Sure.
So
your dad gave you, Sure.
So it wasn't even as if I was kind of rebelling against their decision to call me Tyler.
Yeah.
And I think the move from Tyler to Tyger is very, very similar, right? It's just one letter that is changed.
Sure.
So if I was changing my name to something completely different, and it had nothing to do with my parents and how they raised me, I think I'd probably feel very much less inclined to do something like that. I mean, even if it's like changing my last name, for example, like that would be crazy.
Right?
Sure,
yeah.
And I could do it if I wanted to, but there would be a lot more emotional baggage and friction involved with something like that.
Right. Yeah. But have you told your parents, like, how does your dad feel about his nickname becoming...
when my parents first heard it, they were very, very concerned because I had just said, like, I'm going to change my name and I'm going to do it publicly. And I think at first they maybe thought I was going to change my last name, and that would have been very, very worrisome for them. But when I told my dad that I wanted to change it to the nickname that he had given me, they were supportive of it. A lot of my siblings and a lot of the friends around me, they used to just call me Ty for short.
Right, sure.
Right, and so they can still call me that because Tyger is it still works, So the initial reaction was like, why are you doing something like that? But then as I explained it to them, they were like, okay, that makes sense. Go for it.
Yeah, awesome. So you moved to Korea recently, and you weren't born in Korea, right?
This is my second time ever stepping foot in Korea, and the first time was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, maybe longer than that, and it was just for a week-long period.
Sure,
so,
right. But your ethnicity is like Korean American, right?
That's right.
And this is something I wanted to get into. I mean, we'll start before we get in like the deep ethnos stuff. Maybe we just talk about the reasons for that. Like, why move to Korea now? Like, you visited one. Like, in what respect is this home or is it not home? Like, it's kind of interesting. Like, what's your reasons for doing this?
So I can name a handful of kind of logical, rational reasons.
Sure.
But I think that the real reason was it felt like the right thing to do at this point in my life. But I will give you the pieces of information in terms of maybe why that's so.
Well, tell me about why it felt like the right choice now. Give me
I can give you the rational reason.
But I mean, give me the non-rational reason.
Well,
I want to know
the non-rational reason might be just like I had an intuition that there was interesting opportunities for me if I moved to Korea and kind of journeyed on an adventure of uncertainty. And I think that there's always like a cool thing about moving to a new country or just being somewhere where you're not familiar with, where like you can kind of test yourself in ways that maybe you couldn't in a more comfortable environment. And there's an opportunity to kind of like just rebuild your identity from scratch.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And that is like a freeing thing as well. And so I think that there were some of those urges or appetites to do that. But also I've always had curiosity about like my Korean heritage. And even more background is I did spend 2 summers in Tokyo, Japan when I was an undergrad student. I had done 2 internships there. And when I look at like the most formative or impactful or memorable experiences, those were, some of the most impactful in terms of personal development, I'd say. And it was unfortunate to me that I was doing those internships in Japan and not Korea, because I always had wanted to, kind of reconnect with the culture to some degree. But there just weren't opportunities. And so after those experiences, I had told myself it would be cool later in my 20s to spend some time in Korea. And I always had that in the back of my mind.
I think it's a shame that even though Japan was kind of cool in the 70s and 80s, it's still, at least when it comes to foreign workers and stuff, seems a bit more open and still kind of a bit more open than Korea does. But regardless, I agree with you. Like, in my experience at least, whether I wanted it, whether I was looking for it or not, living in a different country, whether that's for a month, 2 months, or even like a year, because I studied in Germany for a year, it's always been a catalyst for some sort of change, either with me personally or in my life. And then, spending more time in the US was definitely that. And then this year, especially, moving to Korea has definitely done that. Which is interesting, for people who want that kind of thing. I think most people stay in one place most of their life.
There's an inertia to comfortability, right? And there's a lot of and there's a lot of fear of, I think, trying something new. Well,
maybe this is a slightly kind of non-egalitarian thought, but also I think it's best for most people. I think most people like to be around people like them. They like to be in a comfortable setting. They like routine. They like their own culture, etc., etc. I think it's maybe only a good thing for some people, which is why actually I think that a lot of Western people are quite unhappy, because they have been sold this thing as being a global citizen, or that travel is kind of the goal of work or whatever, like being able to travel and stuff. And I think a lot of people go to a really different country and they don't really know what to do, if that makes sense. They'll look up like top 10 attractions and they'll eat some food, and there's nothing really deeper than that. You might as well go to a theme park, as far as I'm concerned. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. I mean, I think some people use it as an escape. An escape from maybe responsibilities or from just like harsh realities about their
life. I think I'm kind of guilty of that, running off to different countries, to be fair. But I mean, there's usually a deeper reason for it. Like in the US, I had a lot of connections for writing and stuff that I wanted to hang out with in person. Korea, I definitely wanted to engage more with Buddhism and stuff. So it's usually a deeper reason. But I definitely used it to run away from a place I didn't like or people I didn't like.
And I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on your perspective in terms of travel and how it should be done. Like for me, this is I don't like going from one place to the next and spending like a week in a location. I really like to try and like absorb as much of the culture in an authentic way as possible. And so, I've been here for 2 months, and I'm going to be here for at least another month, and I'll probably come back through 2025. But for me, I came from the mindset of like, I have a very good understanding of like who I am at this point, like a much better understanding than I did like a decade ago. So the adventure wasn't so much of I'm going to go and kind of discover myself, or something like that, or find my own identity, because I feel like I already had a
and I'm definitely being like really judgmental, but that phrase you just said is something I've heard from these sorts of people a lot.
Yeah. In terms of why they want to travel.
Well, I'm like, there's nothing to find. There's nothing to find, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, and look, I think maybe certain travel experiences can help you realize things about yourself that you didn't realize otherwise. Right? I mean, if you just look at it from the simple perspective of, like, if you look at a scientist and how they treat, let's say, like, chemicals, right? It's like they do different things to it, right? They heat it up and see what the boiling point is. They try and freeze it. They try and mix it with other substances, right? They're experimenting with that substance to try and get an understanding for what it is. And I think maybe in the same way, even if you look at like the human soul, for example, it's like in one context, in one environment, maybe you can only get so much information. But if you start throwing that human soul into different circumstances and different environments and different stresses, you can maybe get a better understand for like who that individual is. And so maybe travel in some extent can help you, but that wasn't necessarily my objective.
No. Yeah. But I think to observe that, you need to have that level of awareness, which I don't think most people have.
Yeah.
Anyway, practical reasons. Why practically are you kind of attracted to Korea?
Well, there is the practical dimension of like my own Korean ethnicity.
Sure.
Of like I have grandparents and I had some Korean American friends growing up, and I think if you look at the impact that Korea has had globally in relation to its physical geography and its population size, it's quite outsized, right? And I find that to be interesting.
Yeah.
And just curious. And then from a career perspective, right? It's like, well, I had in anticipation of this move. This move was not a, off the cuff sort of decision. I had thought for a while it would be great to spend a year, 2 years living in Korea and maybe just trying to figure out professionally and long-term career-wise what it was I really wanted or I was like capable of doing well.
Right.
And so your dollars go a lot farther in this country than it does in the States.
Yeah.
And even Seoul as a city, just in terms of comfort and convenience, the amount of cafes, the high rule of law of like, you can leave your stuff at cafes, walk around for a couple hours, come back, and nobody will have touched your stuff.
Yeah.
Like there are just some practical dimensions of why it made sense for me to be in Korea as well. So yeah, kind of a combination of those things. And then maybe the other thing is I did have an idea, like a business idea of over the past maybe 4 or 5 years, I had dabbled in these like internet communities.
Yeah.
And through them, I had, made friends. I had found kind of like intellectual sparring partners.
Sure.
And even from a business perspective, like developed a business network of very diverse sets of people. And I realized like, wow, communities that just couldn't exist when the internet was not around can exist now. And there's still a lot of experimentation, I think, to be done in that space.
Yeah.
And one of the things in coming to Korea that I was a little bit surprised by was that there is no kind of global digital ecosystem that connects the Korean diaspora.
Yeah.
And there are over 7 million people in the Korean diaspora, and a lot of them are like founders or creatives or working professionals. And I could see how something like that could be valuable. And so I had that idea in the back of my mind of maybe this is a project that I could and should work on.
Yeah.
And since coming to Seoul, even increasingly so, I'm getting excited about it.
We'll talk about that, what you're doing now, because I do find it very interesting. And because I think there's some parallels to some of the communities I'm involved in. But I do want to just rewind a little bit because, and I it's interesting because I was introduced to you by a friend, and he knows my story, and he was like, oh, it's a very similar thing. Like, I was like, you left the job in finance,
right?
You're working for Goldman, right?
Yeah.
And you were also living in the US, and you're a US citizen, right?
That's right.
And you've come to Korea to make connections and stuff. Most people try and go the other direction, you know?
That's right.
Most people in the planet are trying to go the other way. They want to work in finance, and they want to live in the States. So,
yeah.
I mean, maybe talk about the extent to which you kind of think there's like, okay, everyone's trying to move the other direction. Mm-hmm. Why are you moving the opposite direction? Like, why is that?
I don't know if I entirely know the reasons why. Part of it is pursuing my own curiosity for some of the reasons that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe at some deep level, it's like, it would be cool for me to either build connections here and in some ways like give back to Korea as a country.
Okay.
And it's funny because, I am one of 6 kids. And my older siblings, even though they like enjoy Korean food and are proud of their Korean heritage,
right.
It's not like they have any desires to be going back to Korea necessarily.
Yeah.
Right? It's like they've really assimilated into American culture. But for me, there has always been a bit of a pull, and I can't explain why that pull exists and why it felt like it was the right decision to make this move.
Yeah.
But I mean, it had been pressing on my mind for multiple years of like, hey, this is something that would be cool to do. And I think the most relieving thing about making the move is, with any decision, especially decisions where it's hard to reverse them, it's sometimes scary because you don't have all the information at hand and you don't know how things will play out.
Right.
But like when I moved here, it was like a bit of a relief because it felt like, okay, this was the right decision. Right? Whereas had I had anxiety and second thoughts and life here was uncomfortable and I didn't enjoy the food and just on multiple perspectives the universe was telling me like you made the wrong decision, that would have been frustrating and stressful. Right. But I got here and it couldn't have gone probably any better than it did in terms of that move. And that was deeply relieving to me. And so whatever that pull was, which even I have a hard time articulating exactly why I made the move. It's comforting to know that it went as well as it could.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's a strange thing because a lot of people, do talk about, I'm going to move to a different country and blah 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 blah. And I think that, and this, someone who knows anything about finance is that you don't really get anything unless you take risk.
That's right.
And I think there's 2 things going on, particularly with our generation, is that the kind of economic leverage isn't there anymore to take risks as much as there was in the past, and not for as many people. And then secondly, we've become very risk averse as a culture, I think. Much more risk averse than you would say in like the 20th century, for example. Western culture, yeah. I think that's had an effect on people in general. Yeah, because people don't like do anything, if you know what I mean. Like one conversation that really stuck out to me. This is years ago, and maybe you can talk about what the day-to-day thing without maybe saying names or companies or whatever. But the day-to-day stuff about working in a corporation in the US that you find wanting, because I remember I just had this conversation with an office colleague, right? And it was kind of backed up by a lot of other people there that talking about like dating profiles and dating. And London has these travel zones. Have you ever seen? So it's like zone 1 is generally like central London, zone 2 is like a bit further out. Generally, you basically like pay more if you use public transport, but it also kind of signifies how much time it's going to take to get somewhere. And the general consensus is that no one there would ever date anyone outside of like zone 2. And I'm like, well, I've done some really weird stuff like while I've been traveling, like renting a car and driving out to the Sahara and stuff. But this is a new level of risk averse. Like, not willing to go past zone 2 for like a romantic interest. Like, and they say romance is dead, right? But that was like one of the moments where I was like, oh my God, like our culture is kind of sick. Something's wrong there. Because there should always be, okay, maybe you prefer to date within a commutable distance, but it's not like finding a job. It feels like something's kind of wrong there. But I don't know, what you've found wanting, maybe about American culture, maybe about what you were doing for work before. But that's something that came to my mind when you were talking, at least. Well,
with that, the Zone 1 versus Zone 2, are there any like population or demographic like values that certain people in those geographies have? Because if that were the case, that might make more sense. Of, you know, especially why like a city folk person would be maybe hesitant to date people in the countryside, for example, right? It's like the values are just too different, and life goals are too different.
I get you. No, it was literally down to like distance and convenience and stuff like that. and it's a thing. I would kind of see that maybe a demographics thing would be relevant to the way cities are in the US generally. But for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the age of the city or what, but in London, you have like pockets of what the general population would be, but when it comes to different types of people, you have like spots in different neighborhoods. It's not really to do with that.
I see.
But I can understand from a US perspective, because it's very much different. Like, you have rings of different types of people going away from cities generally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even so, just to maybe go back to the point you made, and just with a work perspective, right? Is I think a lot of people feel frustrated in the environments that they're working in, particularly if they're working for a large corporation.
Right. Again, coming back to the risk averse thing.
Yes, coming back to the risk averse.
So risk averse that this is the reason why 99% of the people don't really do anything.
Yes.
Because it's too risky to do anything.
Yes.
Both for the company and for the individuals.
100%. And I think this is why it's so critical, especially early on, to try and figure out what is the foundation that you're building your career on.
Sure.
Right? Because for a large part of, let's say, career kind of oriented civilizations, it's like you find a company and you work at that company for the rest of your life. And that company gives you benefits.
And maybe even you do what your dad did.
Right. Exactly. And so, I mean, I think that the world we're living in now is it's kind of pushing us to change faster, right? There's so much more turnover in terms of people switching jobs and all of that. And I think that, like, even for myself, when I had started my career working in finance, the realization that I had was I was spending basically like 24/7 in terms of working and working hours, investing in that corporation, right? Building intellectual property for that corporation, building relationships within that ecosystem. And when I had left Goldman, like a couple of years after, there was a sudden like aha moment of, man, I was way more dependent on that company for like my own identity and my own professional well-being than I had even known. Right. Because it felt like I was kind of naked after I had left Goldman. It's like I lost a big part of my identity, but I also lost a lot of the professional assets. It's not like the Excels, the PowerPoints that I was working on. I could just take those with me and like give them to other people, right? And so there was a little bit of a light bulb moment that has like slowly, I would say, deepened over time as well. Of okay, I need to make sure that the foundation, like I have some control and some agency over the foundation that I'm building on. Hence why I even started to be more active on social media, why I started even doing a little bit of writing online, like all of this stuff. And that's why I think the entrepreneurial journey is so unique, because it is an opportunity for personal development as well. It's like you are building your own foundation, right? And I think even to the point of the risk aversion is, as soon as you start to build on a foundation that is, the foundation of which is a corporation, you start investing 5, 10, 20 years, it's like there is some very real risks of you leaving, because like your entire identity has been built on that platform, right? And so people feel stuck, I think. People feel stuck and they feel scared of getting out of that. I mean, I know my friends at Goldman who had said, when I was in my first or second year, I'll stay here for a couple of years, then I'll do something independent or I'll do something on my own, right? And I think with each year that ticks, where they don't make the decision, it becomes increasingly harder and harder.
100%, yeah.
Because they become more dependent on that ecosystem, and that ecosystem kind of pulls them in only strongly. They become so rooted in that it's hard for them to walk away.
That's that inertia we're talking about.
Yeah.
It doesn't just apply to jobs; it applies to lots of different things. I mean, maybe I think it applies to like bad relationships and stuff. You almost get like the sunk cost fallacy on like friendships and relationships that aren't very good.
Yeah.
I think that at least for what I would describe as a Western Faustian society, I think, okay, fine, most people, maybe you should do what your dad did, maybe you should have a stable job, okay? That's fine. That's what keeps the subway running on time for us, right? But I think that the problem is, like, lots of intelligent people, lots of conscientious people, like university graduates and stuff today, it's not like, maybe, everyone would have like a different innovative idea. Okay, maybe like 1 in 100 would actually become something, but that's kind of how society stays innovating. And for a few decades now, I can't think, like, there's been progress, but there's not been innovation on the level of, flight or petroleum or nuclear energy. Like, that's not happened in the last 50 years. And, it's even got to the point where, those small progresses that we do make, like what people are calling AI, but is actually LLMs, which is actually large language models, which is quite a different thing, especially philosophically speaking. It's a completely different thing. I think that's a problem. That's going to be a problem. Because, moving into the future, there's going to be less and less innovation because nobody is taking any risks, and it's going to lead us to it's already happening. We're already stagnating as a culture, and that's a problem.
I don't know. I mean, I think I share some of the fears that you share. One of the things about maybe technology in general is that, kind of like in biology of like testosterone, what tends to happen with testosterone is that it's just an amplifier. Yeah. Right? I was like, if you have certain types of moods or behaviors, if you, in the presence of higher testosterone levels, those tendencies tend to amplify. Right. My thing is with technology is that technology is ultimately an amplifier as well. Sure. And if we lived in a society where we were producing, let's say, independent thinkers, and we were doing that in a culture where taking risks was socially the norm and encouraged, then maybe if you apply technology to that, it's amazing, right? But in a culture where technology is still developing by maybe a very small subset of the society, but the broader population they aren't taking any risks, they don't know how to think independently, they aren't excited about creation or innovation, then technology is going to be having a dampening effect maybe on that society in general. Yeah. That's one of the worries that I have.
Yeah, and I'm reluctant to use this comparison because it is a bit like pop culture-y. But it is very, like, have you ever seen that show Black Mirror?
I have seen a couple episodes.
It is very much like that because it's not like the lowest people in society have been sucked into their smartphones. I know incredibly intelligent people who are, have been sucked. Like, they've just been, their lives, their potential for their 20s has been just one-shotted by Instagram Reels. Yeah. Like, one stupid thing on a phone has just completely one-shotted them. And I mean, we can talk about men specifically, but I also think things like ubiquitous access to pornography is a real problem. It's something that isn't talked about a lot, and I think that it's got a huge connection to what's going on with the birth rate, frankly. And I think, like you're saying, it's amplifying this thing and going one direction. Anyway, we can talk about that. I do want to talk about, like, just going back to really practical stuff. What is your favourite thing about Korea, and what's your favourite thing about the US? I would say for Korea, for me, is what you mentioned before. It's the fact that it's high trust. So you can leave your stuff in a coffee shop. I've gone to the CVS and come back and it's still been there. It took a while for me to get used to that, especially because I spent so much time in London, which is very low. If it's not, like, literally bolted to, like, there are tables and stuff in cafes that are bolted to the floor because people, like, and like, if there's tables outside, they'll be chained up, right? Here in the middle of, like, Gangnam, like, there are cafes with tables outside and they're left outside overnight. And No one comes along and takes them.
Yeah.
But that would happen in London, and I love that. I think it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe it's, there's a reason for that, because Korea is a very homogenous society. Maybe it's very strict with its laws. Laws aren't enforced in London, for example. It's a very unhomogenous society. More than half of London was not born in the UK, for example.
Wow.
So it really is an economic city-state in that regards. So maybe I'm just kind of jealous. I want the other thing, so I'm maybe going too far one way. But that is my favourite thing. I love it so much, and I wish that Europe... Because it was like this 100 years ago in Europe. It was a high-trust society. Anyway, I'm interested to hear what you think.
Well, I won't duplicate your answer, but that's definitely, at the top of my list.
Yeah.
It's one of the...
I think because I've always lived in places that don't have that.
Yeah.
Always lived in places that don't have that.
Yeah.
Apart from maybe... Countryside of the UK is maybe okay a little bit now, but still.
I would say that maybe the other thing, and this ties with some cultural things as well, is just Korean food in general. So I grew up like my grandparents would cook Korean food for me, but it wasn't every single meal. And so one of my worries was like, I'm going to be eating Korean food all the time. Am I going to get sick of it? And am I going to crave food in the States? Because like even just like very basic stuff of even if it's unhealthy is like burgers and fast food and all of that stuff. It's just a completely different experience, right? And the thing that I surprised myself with was I haven't gotten tired of Korean food at all.
Yeah.
And one of the things in the first couple of weeks that I had noticed was even though I didn't live like particularly unhealthy in terms of diet when I was in the States, when I came to Korea, I noticed that my energy levels were quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
And like after meals, I wouldn't have any like post-food coma like lulls that I would have when I was in the States.
Yeah.
And again, it's not like I was eating unhealthy or like behaving unhealthy in any way when I was in the States, but I do think there's quite a gap when it comes to just like general diet and nutrition.
Yeah.
And maybe part of it is like, when you eat Korean food, they give you the banchan, and there's a bunch of like colors and different vegetables that you are offered.
It's more of a varied diet.
Yeah, it's more of a varied diet.
Yeah, to compare to like, US is, you got big portions, right? But you maybe have some different colors on the plate. One thing that is bad about like UK cuisine is everything's beige. We just love carbohydrates. I don't know what it is, but but everything is beige. But it is. You can also eat unhealthy Korean food. There is a lot of unhealthy Korean food. Have you ever been to a CVS? Which is what I ate for like the first 3 months when I moved here, just because it was so convenient, and the CVS was like so much better than like CVS food you would get anywhere.
Wait, what do you mean by CVS? What is that?
Like the convenience store.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
I just ate like that, but then I realised that not having a convenience store kimbap's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't taste right. There's something off about it. There's something weird about it. And having one that's just been made is so much better. So that's one thing. But I think there's a deeper issue here, and it's something that Robert Kennedy talks about. Is there's a lot of sprays and things that go on US crops in because the corn and the wheat is in everything, right? And food is different in the US. There's something weird about it, and because a lot of these things are banned in Europe. Like our bread, if you leave bread out, it will go moldy after a few days. In the US, food doesn't go moldy. There's something weird going on. And it does taste different, and I feel the same way as you. Like, because I understand. Like, I'm European. I've got the enzymes for breaking it down. So I love bread. It's probably one of the biggest things I miss food wise. But European bread, okay, fine, it's heavy, whatever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make me feel tired, and make my guts feel weird.
Yeah.
In the US, whenever I've had bread, it makes me feel that way. There's something in the water, so to speak, in US food.
Yeah.
There's something there. Because food doesn't go off in the US, really.
That's right.
There's something that's going on, because there are there's around 32 pesticides and treatment chemicals that are just completely banned elsewhere in the world. And the lobbies are too big in the US for them to ban that. And similar with Korea, like I can have lots of carbs and stuff in it. Okay, I know I've eaten some carbs, but it's not the same thing.
It's not, and that's.
And you're a much healthier guy than me.
Yeah.
So you probably know a lot more about this subject than I do. But there is something weird about it.
Well, I mean, when it comes to like nutrition science and all that stuff, I'm not well educated, but I mean, all of what you've said, I have heard before, and even though I haven't personally done the research to verify it, just in terms of anecdotal experience and my move to Korea, and the fact that like, why do I feel like my energy levels are so much more stable and consistent here than compared to when I was eating food in the U.S. And again, I wasn't eating particularly unhealthy foods. You know, I believe that something weird is going on. Yeah, and it's scary.
So what's the worst thing about Korea, and what's the worst thing about the States? Because actually, where were you living in the States? Because that makes a big States. The United States is a big country, right? Mm-hmm. Lots of different flavors of Americans. Lots of different flavors of America. Where were you living though? That's
I was in the Midwest, so Chicagoland suburbs is where I'm from originally.
But there's a big difference from like downtown Chicago to like being out a bit.
There is. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But what was your least favorite thing about the US?
What was my least favorite thing about the US? You know, it's funny because like when you're in an environment for so long, you just kind of take things for granted, and sometimes you don't even realize like what are the things that you really enjoy about the place and what are the things that you don't. Yeah. So in terms,
it's definitely driven by my own feelings. I think, especially in recent years, my hatred for where the UK's gone has grown so much. I can give you a long list of things I hate.
What's at the top? Do you have one at the top for the UK?
One at the top. Yeah, it's the immigration thing's got out of hand. Like I'm pro immigration. Like immigration can be a good thing if it's managed correctly. But yeah, it's too much in too short a period of time. But the thing is, I'm not. You know, I don't think I'm some sort of, you know, xenophobic person. I just think that has a lot of knock-on effects on the things we talked about. It has a knock-on effect on people's engagement with society, engagement with communities. Then also whether the society is high trust, low trust, whether you feel safe going places, lots of different things.
Yes, I mean
traditional thing like people don't go to traditional institutions like the church, or in the English case, the pub, and they shut down. I've seen pubs that have been converted into fried chicken takeaways, for example, which is funny, but it's depressing when you're English and you've walked past a pub for many years and now it's a chicken shop, and they didn't even bother taking the signs down. So yeah, that's me. I can give you a long list about the UK. I can be negative about that all day. So that's maybe I'm projecting on you with my question. Maybe the US is a pretty good country. I don't know.
The US has many issues. I mean, I think maybe if I lived in Texas or the South, where the immigration issues would be more upfront and
yes,
center.
Okay, yeah, because Chicago's right at the top, right?
Yeah. It would be a little bit of a different dynamic. I mean, the fact that we don't have like the safety that we have here in Korea, I think I appreciate that a lot more here in Korea, and I didn't realize how life could be. So that's definitely one.
That's actually an interesting point. I didn't realize how life could be because you were saying that kind of when you're in it, it's just the default. Right. And I suppose I was kind of thinking the same way, like, you know, being in London, being on edge all the time is just the way things are. Like I visited recently, as you know, and I deliberately avoided London as much as I could, but I did want to go and see a friend, right? And literally, I spent half a day in London, and I was accosted by like 3 different people and followed by 1. And that was normal. That was a normal day in the last few years in London. You know, if you're just on public transport or whatever, there's just weird people around. It's just a normal day. I had a very similar experience in New York, to be honest with you, as well. And when you're in it, you can't really see a way out of it. But moving here and seeing the difference, it does make you think that, you know, I don't want to go back to that, number one, but also that, you know, there's a different way to manage the society. There's a different way to live with other people. Yeah. It's tough for me to pinpoint one thing about the U.S. society that I don't like. But I think the one thing that just stands out in general is the fact that quality of life overall, I would have expected that coming to Korea, I would have experienced some degradation in terms of quality of life. But I would say, like, my quality of life here is probably better than it is back in the States. Yes, and on a lot less money. Or barely even any money. Yes. Really. Yes. I think this is one thing that a lot of people look at the cost of living indexes and stuff, And Seoul is really confusing because people put it on par with London. Mm-hmm. And Seoul is a city where you can spend a lot of money if you want to. You can definitely have a really nice apartment. Sure. You can go to a really nice restaurant or whatever. But as we mentioned before, it's also a place where you can save a lot of money. Mm-hmm. It's completely different from London. London, you don't have a choice. You're going to be spending £20 on lunch whether you like it or not. New York's the same, right? Yeah. It's very different. And your standard of living jumps even if you're on a very, very low salary. So I totally agree. But anyway, let's be negative about Korea. What's your least favorite thing about Korea so far?
I think it's probably the same thing that I now realize is my favorite thing about the U.S., which is when I talk to, let's say, English-speaking native Koreans here, I can just tell how different my mind works from their mind, right? Where whether it's like rule following or just like exercising some personal agency, it's like my tendency, and this has been increasing so over the last decade for me, is like always have more personal agency, always be like the one to initiate, right?
Sure.
And that mindset it's a very, I guess, more American mindset, right? Mm-hmm. It's a much more Western mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think that the power of the group is much more kind of the focus here.
Yes.
Right? Group harmony.
Maybe,
right?
And it's one of those things where that leads to the benefits that we were talking about, but it also has that strange kind of oppressive effect.
Yeah.
Something I've observed, and this is probably my least favorite thing as well, is, and I don't know whether this is a cultural thing or whether it's a genetic thing, but there is a distinct, I would argue, lack of creativity in the Korean mindset. I'm not saying there isn't creative people. There's creative people. There's artists, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But there is definitely, for the majority of the time, for the majority of people, there is a complete deference to the rules, even if there's no good reason for doing those rules. In the Western mind, like, rules are kind of made to be broken, you know?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's probably...
Which is great, because then you get people who, you know, then you can, you know, there's no one around you can jaywalk if you want, right? But then you also have, you know, well, no one's with this bag, I can take this bag if I want, you know? So you have the positives and negatives, right?
Yes.
There is a weird lack of creativity in just thinking about how to do things, and I think it has a knock-on effect on lots of other things.
Well, and I think this is like one of my favorite writers.
I'm getting deported for that statement.
Are you familiar with Morgan Housel in some of his writing?
No.
So he wrote a book called The Psychology of Money.
Yeah.
And then he followed it up with another book called Same as Ever. But he's primarily a financial writer.
Right.
But one of his observations about successful people, right, is oftentimes the thing that had made them so successful ends up being kind of a knife, or there's some sort of a downside, right, in another aspect of their life.
Sure.
Right? But you can't take that negative dimension of their personality and still get the positive impact of why people respect and admire these successful people, right? And I think maybe to some extent, in terms of what you were saying about Korean society, is it is the same thing, where it's like, for me as an American, living in Korea is a really cool experience, and I think one of the reasons why it's so cool is because the entire society is built upon a structure, a rule-following, law-abiding, you know, deference to authority type of structure, and
there are very basically it's an ethnic thing. There's something that links you with the rest of society.
100%. Yeah. There's a familial dimension to it for sure, and I think that's maybe something that surprised me as well. Not to go too far off topic, right? But it's like. And I didn't internalize this to the same degree until I got here to Korea and realized it. But it's like when I see an elderly grandmother and she's like hauling cardboard up and down the streets, it's like the reality is, and maybe it's just a tribal dimension, is that like my heart, you know, hurts for her because I could see my grandma in her, right? Whereas I don't know, if I'm in the States and it's, you know, let's say an Indian immigrant or a Mexican immigrant or somebody else, and it's a grandmother, I don't know if it hits me the same way. No. And part of me says like, oh man, I wish it would. You know, it's like you want to be kind and you want to have that kind of almost familial dimension. But there's just a reality of like the visual apparatus, there's something about it that is so strong. And that's something that I've realized coming here.
It's also, it's probably a little bit of the perspective as well, because I know that it's more common in the Korean language to say our nation, our country. I think it's more common, especially for Americans, to say my country.
Yes.
And I think, you're looking at someone doing a really tough job in the US or whatever. Maybe they're a different ethnicity from you, maybe they're not. But you do think like, oh, they're deciding to do this job. But then you look at someone in a homogenous culture and you're like, oh, they're being forced to do this job. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in terms of our country tendency is like even within the way in which people address older and younger people that they're familiar with, right? It's like, I don't know, you probably know this, but like if I meet somebody and he is younger than me and we become close friends over time, it's like I call him Dongsen, right? Which is like younger brother. Yeah. And it's a very familial dimension to all of the interactions that you have. Whereas if it was in the States, it's like I wouldn't call him younger brother. If he's a complete stranger that I became friends with over time, we would just become friends. Yeah. Right? And the whole social fabric is very different here.
Yeah, and there's a really strange rigidity to the hierarchy that comes out in the language because I can call my older sister Nuna in Korean. Mm-hmm. But that's the word for an older sister from the male perspective. Right. So even the gender of the person addressing, not just the addressee and the addresser, right, are both important. Yes. Which you definitely don't have that level of complexity in English.
Everything is so precise when it comes to personal relationships because, and I don't know if you know this one, but like, I would call my aunt on my dad's side something different than I would call my aunt on my mom's side, right? Because like my mom's sisters, I would call them imo, but my dad's sisters, I would call them komo, right? And we don't make that distinction in something like in the U.S. It's just you have aunts, you have uncles, right? But there's so much more.
And sometimes your family friend is also your uncle, right? Like it's not clear. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think just kind of before we move off the kind of ethnicity stuff, just because I do want to talk about this with you, because there's some parallels. So I think that there is a difference between a nation's ethnos and a propositional nation. What I mean by a propositional nation is a nation that's basically founded on some sort of idea or convenience, perhaps. And so in terms of propositional nations, the US is a very obvious example, right? US is a very obvious example. But I think that the UK is a good example. Because the UK was made to, bind the British Empire together, pretty much. When it comes to ethnos, like, I guess I'm English, right? And maybe you're Korean. I don't know is American an ethnos? I don't know. Like you were saying, like, it doesn't, like, what really is...
Right, that's why they call it a Korean American, right? Or a Mexican American, or some sort of American.
But I think it's fascinating because, I kind of agree, like, anyone, with the right steps, like, to be American is to have the piece of paper that says you're American, right? Maybe you follow some of the ideals as well, maybe. UK is very similar, I think, as well. As long as you're, a subject of the king, then fine. But I don't think there's anything you can do to become English. I could learn fluent Korean. I could be eating rice and kimchi and banchan every day. I could have a Korean wife and Korean children. I'll never be Korean. Does that make sense? Did you agree with that? I'm definitely going to offend some, like, if there's liberal listeners to this, but I really think this is true. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's good to have your people. And I think there's something. It's becoming true now within the way the US has such division, and the UK is just in so many ways economically, politically, just falling apart.
I do agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you look at the span of, let's say, human civilization, it's like what you're calling is propositional nations. Yeah. They weren't really ever a thing, right? Sure. It's a fairly new thing, right? In terms of getting people of a different ethnic backgrounds, putting them together and unifying them under some flag or some set of ideals. Yeah. Right? For the most part of human history, you had, kind of tribal states, and genetically you guys shared a lot of the same background and ancestry. Yeah. Right? And then there were civilizations formed upon that foundation. Right? And so I think, part of my appreciation and fascination, or just a general observation about living in Korea, is my experience in the US and how profound that whole if you would call it like an American experiment
Yeah.
is, right? Is we're going to take all of these people from very different backgrounds, and we are going to be unified under the Constitution, let's say, right, and these ideals, and we are going to create a new society, right? That whole experiment is like a fascinating one, and it's unfortunate, like I'd say, over the past couple of decades, that it seems like that fabric is being torn, right, because of the division, and there is a question that comes up of like, was it just too hard of an experiment to run and for it to run its course over the long term?
Sure.
Or is there a possibility that the U.S. can kind of come back to center and embrace some common ideals? Like even in terms of free speech, that is like a foundational thing within American history, and there are factions of people in the U.S. that are being opposed to that, right?
Yeah. I would disagree with you to say that there isn't historical precedence. And the big example I would give is the Roman Empire. Because when the Roman Empire was, when it was a republic, when it was an empire, to be a politician or to be in the army and stuff, you would have to be born a Roman citizen. And so that would come with the natural, most likely, like, you would, you're from that place. As the Roman Empire grew and was overstretching itself, had to allow, mercenaries, all sorts of people, and, if you fought for us, you could have citizenship. Okay. And slowly over time it starts to fall down. And I think that, there are definitely some, America's the strongest country that's ever existed on the planet ever.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some benefits to it. But I do think that watering down of the, I guess you could say ethnic, but those immovables, whatever they are, that underneath us, cultural or ethnic immovables, that watering down lends itself to entropy, which is the things falling apart very slowly. I think that's just a natural cycle that always happens. And I think that's what's happening with the UK and the US. But I don't think it's a bad thing. And this is why I don't think people should get so wound up over the birth rate stuff. Because, even if, Korean population has an absolute nosedive, even if, English population has an absolute nosedive, if the UK falls apart, the English people still exist. Like, just because there isn't a state doesn't mean these people don't still exist. Doesn't mean that these people working together don't still exist. I think this is a kind of a short-sightedness we have because we've been under things as formal as the modern nation state for so long. But there are different ways to organise communities and societies, perhaps. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts on the topic. I don't know what you think. Like, because Korea's survived. I mean, it's been invaded and stuff, but it's survived for thousands of years being a hermit kingdom and not allowing anyone in.
Right. It's quite surprising.
Not been the most powerful country in the world, but it's survived. It didn't always have to be a modern nation state to do that.
Right. Well, I think we are going to see some very interesting things in terms of, let's say, human societies. So I just recently finished this guy Balaji Srinivasan. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he used to be the CTO at Coinbase. And he was also a professor at Stanford. I think it was maybe in like chemistry or computer science. And he wrote a book called The Network State. And it has been like deeply impactful in terms of what I'm building, in terms of what the future of nation states and countries and all that stuff looks like. Because his thesis is that in the future, even maybe in a couple of decades, in terms of what the digital world unlocks for humans to connect with each other and basically scale new types of communities, that what you're going to have like these network states where somebody will say, hey, I am going to create a network, and here are the values that this network kind of believes in and embodies, right? If you want to be a part of it, there's going to be some sort of payment, some sort of citizenship process that you'll have to undergo. But if you want to be a part of it, you'll be part of this network, right? And let's say that network can scale to 35,000 plus people, right? And it's only on a digital level at first, where maybe you're building business relationships, or you could even be having local hangouts in various parts of the world. But once you develop a critical mass of individuals who have aligned values, then you could go and you could buy a plot of land, and you could say, okay, this is our new kind of country to some extent, right? So there's very interesting things that happen, but his whole premise is that people are going to self-organize based on the values that they hold, right? And that's very different from starting, like a Korean diaspora community, for example.
Sure.
Right.
Well, while we're on the subject, let's talk about Cambridge, because what I've realized is in a time, social connections, because of the way social media has developed, have become like popcorn, and following someone is and liking something is very pithy. And what I found really useful in the last few years, especially when you find something you're interested in, like me with writing, for example, is you find these communities where you make incredibly high value connections, which is completely different from what social media is moving towards, which is incredibly pithy connections, like nothing really, like almost like, and some of it is parasocial as well, where there's no real benefit for the person who's on the receiving end of.
Right.
And so high value connections where you connect with people in the same way you would on any other platform, but you become close friends with this person. Then you're like, oh my god, I found a lifelong friend. You collaborate with them, you visit them, and you see them in person. These sorts of things. And this is something that I think we've lost, because I think the only group of people who really do this sort of high value networking for a long time have been like the elite of the elite of the elite sort of people. This is a sort of thing you used to get at university and maybe institutions like the ones we've talked about, but I feel like that's gone a lot because of the technology that's amplified it. But anyway, yeah, tell me about what is Cambridge, and does it kind of fit that description I was talking about? Because it seems like it's aiming at this, this very high value connection thing, where it's not going to be maybe a platform that has 1 billion users, right? But it's going to have very high value connections.
Yes, and to be honest, the reality is I don't necessarily know kind of what ultimate form Cambridge will take.
Yeah.
But what I'll say is, over the past 2 or 3 years, like even the reason why I met Chris was through a platform called Nest Labs.
Yeah.
Right, and it was like a community for like productivity and mindfulness. Right. What I had realized is just like how powerful these communities can be if they facilitate the strengthening of relationships rather than kind of what social media does, which is you can see images of people on a screen, but you don't really know who they are, and you don't actually have a relationship with them.
Yeah.
Right. My whole thing is, okay, I'm coming here to South Korea. The Korean diaspora is quite large. And there are opportunities for people to get connected and to benefit from either personal development or professional development. And it seems like a no-brainer to me that common heritage can be the starting point for somebody to build their own personal network.
Yeah.
Right? And I interviewed somebody recently, this guy Quang Do, and he is the co-founder of Overseas Vietnamese, which is basically a very similar thing.
Right.
It focuses primarily on professional development, but he's got like a LinkedIn group page of over 35,000 people in it, and they're all Vietnamese, of Vietnamese heritage, all over the world. And he has decided, hey, I'm going to start an in-person conference, 3-day conference in Ho Chi Minh City. And he's brought a bunch of people from the Vietnamese diaspora who've never even been to Vietnam before to invest back into the country and to meet other people of Vietnamese heritage.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, it's like there seems like this no-brainer opportunity to do something cool, to provide a service that would enrich people's lives.
Yeah.
Because I know personally, like Korean Americans who would love to get connected with other people of Korean heritage all over the world. And I am in Korea right now, so I'm meeting a lot of interesting Koreans who have ambitions to go to Canada or the States or to Australia for business or whatever. Right? And so I feel like I'm uniquely positioned to start to provide that and build that network. However, the thing that I will say is, I think ultimately what is going to allow such a community to thrive over the long term is that the people have some sort of shared values.
Right.
And even if there are people that, let's say, care about the Korean cause, but are not even of Korean ethnicity, I want those people to be able to partake in the community as well. So maybe this whole thing ends up morphing into something completely different, where it's not just serving the Korean diaspora, but because I see that common point being powerful catalyst to kickstart this community.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I've been really excited about.
It jumps it up to immediately, when you're not doing things based on ideas, but you're doing it based on identity and who people are, you immediately make those connections high value. I feel like you just jump up to that point immediately.
Yes.
So I think that's really strong, and I think it's a really interesting idea what you're doing. I will leave like relevant links in the description of this one. Was there anything else you wanted to plug while we're here? Cambridge will definitely link.
No, I mean I can include my like personal websites, and I've on a monthly basis. Even in terms of relationships, the thing that I've advised people that were younger than me in terms of what's been the most powerful thing is you acquire so many relationships over time, especially if you're active on social media, that sometimes it's hard to keep in touch with those people, or maybe just at whatever point you're at in life, it doesn't really make sense for you to be having weekly, monthly, quarterly communications with that person, just because of the life stage that you're in, right? But what's been really helpful for me is if I meet somebody that's interesting and that I think has some shared values, and maybe there's potential collaboration opportunities or just opportunities to benefit from meeting with one another in the future, I have been sending basically a monthly update on the learnings that I've had, the podcast that I've been recording. And sometimes, people will come across that and it'll just hit their inbox and they'll just take a quick peek and they'll leave, right? But over time, there have been people that I met when I was, early on in my Goldman career. And then years down the line, I'll forget that they are still receiving my monthly updates. But then there'll be a catalyst of like, for that person to send a message or be like, hey, I'm working on a project related to this book you're reading. You might find it interesting. And that has been really powerful to retain the longevity of relationships and to rekindle old relationships that I might have completely forgot that I had even like built.
Right.
So I highly recommend people to do that as well. Cool. And I can link the newsletter that I've been working on as well.
Nice. So there is a last question that I ask everyone I speak to when I speak to them for the first time, which is, I'm not sure why. Normally I talk to people who have more controversial reasons for this, but let's imagine you were on death row, okay? Maybe, I don't know, you did something illegal in Korea and now you're, I don't know. Okay, you're on death row, okay? What's your last meal?
Oh boy, what is my last meal? I think I'm just being in Korea right now. I've had some incredible Korean barbecue experiences, and I think that's how I would have to go out, is embracing my Korean heritage.
Ajushi style?
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. Thanks, Tyger.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.